Scarface wrote a song about this dude in 2000. And I think he wrote 2 songs about this dude. Really just, it's disgusting.
Now they just popped one of them. It was 2, like real, many of them, but these 2 was like, they were straight gunners.
Imagine dropping a record so raw it rattles the federal government. That's exactly what Scarface did.
But I can't get no peace, 'cause Chewbacca's been chasing me.
Behind his verses were federal testimonies, leaked DEA emails, and Jay Prince's own accounts of intimidation.
So you got a DEA agent that has like 8 to 10 bodies that he done killed, and he been assigned for you to be the next person.
For years, they dismissed him as another angry rapper until the indictments came. The lines he wrote in fury became evidence, and somewhere between Houston's streets and Washington's offices, the truth finally caught up.
DEA agent was corrupt, and he was set to destroy our prominent hip-hop labels at the time. Who knows what's out there now?
This is the story the feds never wanted told. The day Scarface dissed the FBI and won. Let's talk about it. In the 1990s, Houston was building a threat to the feds. The city didn't move like New York or LA. It pulsed, slow, calculated, the kind of place where people moved in silence and let the streets talk. Somewhere inside that rhythm was a kid named Brad Jordan, and the world would come to know him as Scarface. He wasn't just another rapper trying to get out of the hood. He was from 5th Ward, the same block that raised hustlers, dealers, and survivors. A place where people learned to read the world before they ever read a book. He had joined the Ghetto Boys of Rap-A-Lot at the height of their chaos, when the group was as unstable as it was groundbreaking. They weren't polished or clean. They were raw, dangerous, and brilliant.
People love Ghetto Boy. We super fans.
Big fans of Ghetto Boys.
Yeah.
Scarface, Willie D, and Bushwick Bill were 3 men who looked like America's nightmare and sounded like its conscience. Their music didn't hide behind metaphors. It spoke directly to the pain that polite society didn't want to hear. That honesty came at a cost. While mainstream America was busy celebrating safe hip-hop, Scarface was being called a threat, not just to culture, but to control. But before Scarface, the founder of Rap-A-Lot Records, James Prince, was the architect. He was also 5th Ward, born and raised. The man had turned street codes into corporate structure. He wasn't trying to fit into the music industry. He was building his own system entirely outside of it. Prince's story had already crossed a line that made the government uneasy. Back in 1988, not long after Rap-A-Lot started making noise, a car tied to his old dealership was found near El Paso with 76 kilos of hidden inside. Prince wasn't charged, but the moment that case landed on a federal desk, it opened a file that would stay open for decades.
They seen Jay Prince as a threat early on. They tried to take him out early on. And now we're starting to see that people around that was dirty.
The agents assigned to investigate Rap-A-Lot, Jack Schumacher and Chad Scott, were already infamous inside DEA circles. Schumacher had testified before Congress about dozens of gunfights, and media reports linked him to multiple fatal shootings. He denied being rogue, but his track record said otherwise.
They assigned a guy by the name of Schumacher, on me to arrest me, to whatever he was supposed to do, but he sent death threats at me.
Chad Scott was worse. On the streets, they called him the White Devil, ruthless, unrestrained, and known for bending rules until they broke. Together, they were sent to Houston with one mission: dismantle Rap-A-Lot from the inside out. Federal agents started sitting in unmarked cars near the Rap-A-Lot compound. There were random stops, subtle intimidation, and phones began to click in the background mid-call. Surveillance vans even followed artists to studio sessions. It was quiet pressure at first, psychological warfare, and when that didn't shake them, they turned the heat up. Jay Prince would later recall that the agents made their intentions clear. They weren't looking for justice. They were looking for blood. They didn't believe someone from 5th Ward could make millions legally, so they decided to prove otherwise. They raided affiliated properties, questioned employees, even approached ex-associates in prisons across Texas, trying to buy a confession that didn't exist. Millions of taxpayer dollars went into what would eventually become one of the longest-running DEA pursuits in Southern hip-hop history.
They've been at me damn near all my life, when I, started moving, when I made the transition, they never, that hunt didn't stop.
And at the center of their strategy was Scarface, The DEA's files on Rap-A-Lot mentioned Scarface by name. He was described as a significant target. They believed that if they could arrest Scarface, if they could flip him, he would lead them straight to Prince. Inside Houston, that wasn't news. Everyone knew law enforcement had eyes on Rap-A-Lot, but Scarface kept recording. He wasn't scared of microphones. Instead, he used them as weapons. When Scarface dropped Mr. Scarface, it wasn't just another gangster rap record, it was a declaration of war. The DEA had assumed these were street guys who would fold under pressure. Instead, Scarface turned the entire ordeal into an indictment set to a drum beat. The track didn't waste time with metaphors or coded threats. It opened like a case file. Scarface rapped about crooked cops, federal agents planting evidence, and the quiet deals being made behind closed doors. For listeners in the Fifth Ward, it was less entertainment and more testimony. A record that dared to say what people whispered about in barbershops. But with Mr. Scarface, the tone shifted. He wasn't just telling stories anymore. He was calling names. He described white devils in badges, a line many recognized as a direct shot at DEA agent Chad Scott, the same man the press would later call the dirtiest agent in the South.
It's common for cops to be dirty, and it still is. It's just common for us. And what makes it so sick and dirty is that you're never going to have a cop that's going to step up and go against the machine.
To the casual listener, the song was raw, defiant, maybe even reckless. But to those inside the industry, and especially those inside Rap-A-Lot, it was calculated. This was Scarface telling the government that they'd been seen. Every raid, every intimidation, every stop and search was being documented, not in legal filings, but in bars. You can't bury the truth if the record spins forever, he'd say later in an interview. The public response was split right down the middle. On one side, hip-hop heads across the South hailed it as an act of rebellion. They saw it as a voice from within the chaos. Proof that you could still fight back, even when the system had you cornered. But on the other side, media outlets and law enforcement panicked. The same week the record dropped, Houston radio stations received informal advisories, warning against promoting music that glorifies resistance to law enforcement. Scarface didn't back down. In interviews, he doubled down. When asked whether he feared government retaliation, he responded plainly, "Man, I ain't make this up. I lived it." He explained that rap, at least the way he practiced it, wasn't fiction, it was evidence. If a cop shakes you down on your way to work, that's your story, he told one journalist. If they bug your phone, that's your verse. It was a philosophy that turned music into protest, and protest into public record. That philosophy didn't go unnoticed. Within months, the IRS began auditing both Scarface and Rap-A-Lot's parent company.
What they had done was jumped on a couple guys. They pulled them over. They took them down to the station, stripped them naked, jumped on them, took their jewelry, all kinds of stuff, and sent messages.
Touring plans were disrupted, shows were mysteriously canceled, insurance providers backed out of contracts, and promoters received quiet warnings from local officials. When Prince tried to book Scarface for performances in other states, venues suddenly claimed technical issues or security concerns. Behind closed doors, it was clear the music had hit a nerve and the response was coordinated. In one Houston Chronicle article from that era, an unnamed DEA spokesperson described Rap-A-Lot's releases as threatening to national order. That was the kind of language reserved for militias, not musicians. But to the government, that line was blurry. On Capitol Hill, politicians were arguing that rap glorified violence. Never mind that the violence was often directed at the very artists trying to describe it. Scarface's record complicated that narrative. It didn't glorify violence, it exposed institutional abuse. It showed that in Houston, the government's war on drugs had turned into a war on sound. The feds didn't care about the distinction. They tightened the net. Scarface's accounts were flagged by intelligence analysts under domestic influence tracking. The same systems used to monitor extremist threats were being used to catalog lyrics from a Texas rapper. Yet even under that scrutiny, Scarface kept releasing music that poked at the same wound. Each verse felt like a challenge, a refusal to be intimidated. By the mid-1990s, Scarface had already built a reputation beyond the South. Def Jam had partnered with him for the launch of Def Jam South, a move that brought national visibility to Southern rap. Suddenly, Houston wasn't the underdog anymore. It was a threat to the entire industry hierarchy. And that's when the pressure got even worse.
I saw the conspiracy taking place where they wasn't going to allow any more Master P's, Cash Money, Irv Gotti.
Independent.
Yeah,
people.
independents.
Internal DEA emails leaked, revealing how deep it went. One agent described Rap-A-Lot as a RICO target masked as a record label. Another memo suggested that Scarface could provide strategic leads to connect J. Prince to alleged narcotics operations. They even discussed manipulating media narratives, feeding selective stories to local reporters to make the label appear criminal. It wasn't just surveillance, it was character assassination. The more Rap-A-Lot grew, the more aggressive the tactics became. Agents began stopping artists on tour. They'd flash badges, search buses, and take photos without explanation. Studio raids became routine checks. Local officers claimed they were just investigating gang-related activity, but every path led back to the same source, the DEA's Houston Task Force. And J. Prince noticed the pattern. He spoke years later about one of the agents assigned to him, a man with 8 to 10 bodies on his record. They made it clear, he said, they wanted me to be the next one.
So you got a DEA agent that has like 8 to 10 bodies that he done killed, and he been assigned for you to be the next person.
When asked how he handled it, his answer was simple: if we're going to draw, I need to win. The tension wasn't just personal, it was systemic. While most of America saw rap as entertainment, inside government buildings, it was a national concern. Federal briefings began referring to labels like Rap-A-Lot, Death Row, and Murder Inc. as fronts. Politicians were pushing the idea that hip-hop was a cultural pipeline for drug money, and to a generation raised under Reagan's war on drugs, that narrative made perfect sense. But this was different. This wasn't just about arresting dealers. It was about silencing influence. When a label from Houston started rivaling New York and LA on charts, when their lyrics started echoing social truths louder than government press releases, that's when the feds stepped in. So they tapped phones. They followed convoys. They leaned on local officers to make traffic stops that turned into interrogations. They sent word to business partners, hinting that federal scrutiny could make things complicated. Every move Rap-A-Lot made was met with invisible resistance.
So they went to every penitentiary in Texas to get somebody to flip on me.
Yeah.
You know, they spent millions of dollars, millions of dollars.
Still, no one cracked. Years passed. Millions spent. Countless hours of surveillance logged. And nothing. No drugs. No laundering, no charges that would stick, just a paper trail of intimidation and racial profiling disguised as law enforcement. Prince started documenting everything: the names, the stops, the words they used. Then Congresswoman Maxine Waters got involved. That was a power play the feds didn't expect. Waters put the allegations on paper. Her letter to Attorney General Janet Reno called out the harassment directly: rogue officers, racial slurs, illegal searches, constant intimidation. She made it impossible for the DEA to keep pretending it was a normal investigation.
Maxine Waters, you
shout
know
out
what
to
I mean?
her.
Like a hip,
She really
like
goes
an
hard for
angel.
us.
You know what I mean? Because where all the politicians in my city, nobody would help me.
When Prince met the investigators from the DEA's Office of Professional Responsibility, he refused to meet them alone. He demanded the meeting happen inside Maxine Waters' office in Washington, under political protection. And they agreed, because they had to. He told them everything about being pulled over on dark stretches of highway, about how one officer tried to lure him into a shadowed McDonald's lot, how he refused, choosing a Shell station instead, somewhere with light and witnesses, and how Agent Jack Schumacher rolled up minutes later, his reputation already known. "I'm aware of this guy being a killer," Prince told them. First of all,
same thing. You know what I mean? It's something I'm like, hey, this dude here is a killer way back then. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So they, other words, they know these people exist, and they'll let them keep on working for them and doing their thing until
For a man like Prince, who had spent years building a label from nothing, mentoring rappers who came from real danger, the irony wasn't lost. He was being hunted by the same government that ignored the real killers. The same agency whose agents, he said, were killing and destroying lives, taking dope, flipping it back into the streets. Inside the DEA, the tension was rising too. Their own files showed internal cracks. Supervisors were warning the agency to stop pursuing new leads until the OPR investigation was cleared. One memo even called it unfortunate, admitting that they were losing hard-fought, costly gains. They had spent millions trying to flip someone, anyone, on Prince. Nothing stuck. When the DEA finally pulled back, it wasn't out of mercy. It was because of pressure, political, public, and internal. Schumacher was reassigned to desk duty. The Houston division was told to stop all active investigations tied to Rap-A-Lot. But by then, the damage was done. The agents had spent a decade trying to build a RICO case that didn't exist. And in that time, Scarface had been watching, writing, and waiting. He had seen friends get harassed, calls tapped, reputations dragged through the mud, and if they wanted a confession, he was ready to give them one, just not in court. He'd give it to them on wax. In October 2000, The Last of a Dying Breed dropped. On Look Me in My Eyes, Scarface rapped,
But I can't get no peace, cause Schumacher's been chasing me.
He didn't hide behind metaphors. He said the names out loud. On The Gangsta he doubled down.
Chad, it's Jay Prince and Brad.
It wasn't coded. It was confession and retaliation wrapped in rhyme. Scarface wasn't just dissing rivals. He was naming federal agents on a record, the same ones who'd tried to bury his label. The reaction was instant. Local media called it reckless. National outlets painted Rap-A-Lot as dangerous, a criminal enterprise hiding behind music. Scarface's message was twisted into menace. What they missed was the point. He wasn't glorifying crime. He was calling out corruption. The tension spilled into real life. Agents began appearing at shows. Plainclothes officers started showing up at the label's office in 5th Ward. It was intimidation by presence, the kind that doesn't need words. Fans saw it too. Some thought it was part of the act. Others realized it wasn't. Scarface looked tired in interviews around that time. His voice carried weight, not from fame, but from fatigue. Every rhyme now came with risk. Every show felt like it could be the last before another setup. Still, he kept talking. Let them listen, he said in one radio spot. They already watching. Might as well give them something real to hear. That was the moment the story shifted. It wasn't the government versus a rapper anymore. It was a system versus a voice. The DEA had tried to silence Rap-A-Lot through fear. Instead, they made them louder. Scarface's words had started as art. Now, they were evidence, a record of survival, and in naming the men who hunted them, he'd done what few ever dared. He'd flipped the power dynamic. By the time the agents he named were later indicted on corruption charges, the track sounded less like defiance and more like prophecy. The same system that had stalked him had finally turned on itself. And Scarface, he just kept rapping. Because for him and for Jay Prince, winning didn't mean escaping the fight. It meant surviving it long enough to tell the story. In late 2000, there was a hearing in the House Committee chamber in Washington, D.C. Cameras were rolling, suits filled the room, and a group of men who once raided homes and kicked in doors were now the ones answering questions under oath. The hearing's title sounded sterile. Were criminal investigations swayed by political considerations? But everyone in the room knew what it really meant. Did the DEA go too far trying to take down James Prince? The early testimonies painted a clear picture of frustration and pride. DEA agents and Houston police officers sat behind microphones, explaining how their case, years in the making, was suddenly cut off. They said they'd built something solid. They had links, money trails, names, and witnesses. They even pointed to a major seizure from years earlier, 76 kilograms of tied to one of Prince's car dealerships. To them, this wasn't about a rap label anymore. This was about unfinished business. Special Agent Jack Schumacher, the same man Scarface once rapped about as "Schumacher's been chasing me," leaned into the mic and said what every agent at that table was thinking. The kingpins were saved. His words hit like a gunshot. He said the investigation had been sabotaged by political pressure, that if the case had continued, there would have been more convictions. The tension in the room was obvious. Congressman Dan Burton, the committee chair, looked up from his papers and asked flatly, "You're saying politics shut it down?" Schumacher didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." To the agents, Rap-A-Lot had outmaneuvered them using influence instead of evidence. To J. Prince and Scarface, this hearing was proof that what they'd been saying in their music wasn't paranoia, it was real. The entire country was now watching government officials admit, under oath, that the system wasn't always clean. When the name Scarface came up, the room's energy shifted. Congressman Ron LaTourette pulled out a copy of The Last of a Dying Breed. He said they were going to enter its lyrics into the official record. The phrase alone, official record, sounded absurd, but there it was. A rap album being treated like a piece of federal evidence. LaTourette read aloud from Look Me in My Eyes, pausing at the line that called out the agents by name.
Chad, it's J. Prince and Brad.
Then came The Gangsta, the track where Scarface said, Jed and Chad, it's J. Prince and Brad. You could hear small murmurs ripple through the crowd. The committee wanted to frame it as proof that the artists were taunting the system, but the irony was thick. Those lyrics were never fiction, they were documentation. When the track played through the chamber's speakers, you could almost see the unease in the room. The bass line shook the walls, Scarface's gravelly voice filling a space usually reserved for legal arguments. Chairman Burton interrupted when he noticed a few people smirking at the lyrics. You find that funny? He asked. That's number 7 on the Billboard charts. His tone was half disbelief, half warning. Agent Michael Chasson followed up by saying the songs were dangerous, that they sent the wrong message, teaching kids that they could beat the system. But the hearing exposed a strange contradiction. Federal agents were trying to paint Scarface's music as a threat, while their own testimony was proving that every lyric had come from something real. They admitted they'd followed the label's artists, tapped phones, falsified warrants, and carried out stops under fake pretenses. One officer even said he recognized Scarface's name from the reports, confirming that the music they were calling dangerous was actually describing their own actions. Years later, when portions of the courtroom transcripts resurfaced, they revealed what fans had always suspected. Rap-A-Lot wasn't being paranoid, it was being hunted. Agents admitted to surveillance operations that went beyond standard procedure. Warrants were signed without full cause, and targets were identified by association. Somewhere between those testimonies and Scarface's records, a quiet shift happened. The same songs that were once used against him started sounding like evidence in his favor. What had been labeled gangsta rap began to look more like journalism with a rhythm track. Defense lawyers later said that if the hearing did anything, it proved one thing beyond argument, that the federal government really had tried to corner Rap-A-Lot. Scarface's music had told the truth before anyone in power dared to admit it. For the first time, the curtain had finally been lifted. But it didn't end in a courtroom for Rap-A-Lot. Not theirs anyway. The real ending came 2 decades later, in another courtroom, hundreds of miles away, where the hunter finally stood as the hunted. The year was 2021. The name on the federal indictment wasn't J. Prince, or Scarface, or anyone from Rap-A-Lot. It was Chad Scott, the same DEA agent who had spent years chasing ghosts in Houston, the one they called the White Devil. The same man Scarface once called out by name in his music was now standing before a judge, facing the same justice system he'd once used like a weapon. By then, the story had gone quiet for most people. Rap-A-Lot had survived. Scarface had gone on to become a respected elder in hip-hop, and J. Prince had turned into a symbol of independence in the industry. But in the background, the feds had been building a new kind of case, not against artists, but against their own. It started small. In 2016, whispers began circulating that a veteran DEA agent out of Louisiana was under investigation. The accusations didn't sound new: falsified reports, stolen property, and hidden assets. But as the evidence stacked up, the picture became undeniable. This wasn't just a bad cop, it was a pattern of corruption that stretched back decades, straight to Houston. Prosecutors said Chad Scott had turned his badge into a hustle. He was stealing cash and property from defendants, taking their wallets, phones, and keys during drug raids, then pocketing what he liked.
Chad Scott was convicted by a jury for corruption charges. They're saying that him and his co-defendant Rodney Geemer stemmed from being accused of taking money and items during drug raids and destroying evidence.
In one case, he directed a known to buy him a $43,000 Ford F-150 truck. He filed false paperwork claiming it had been seized in New Orleans so he could register it as a government vehicle, his own personal ride paid for by taxpayers. When Scott realized investigators were closing in, he tried to clean up the mess. He and his partners drove into the swamps outside New Orleans and dumped evidence into the water: documents, records, proof, they were all gone, or so they thought. But investigators had already built enough to move forward. The deeper they dug, the darker it got. Scott was caught falsifying reports, lying under oath, and coercing witnesses to give false testimony, the exact tactics Rap-A-Lot had accused him of decades earlier. One case stood out. 2 Houston drug dealers came forward, admitting that Scott had pressured them to lie in a New Orleans trial. He had forced them to identify the wrong man as a major supplier, a lie that sent an innocent person to prison. In another case, the past came roaring back. The 1997 murder conviction of Houston music producer Lamar Burks was suddenly back in question. Witnesses Randy Lewis and Clayton Brown testified that Chad Scott and Jack Schumacher, the same duo who'd gone after Rap-A-Lot, had threatened their lives and forced them to implicate Burks falsely. They even admitted that the real goal had been to find leverage against Rap-A-Lot records. The ghosts of those old DEA files were finally speaking, and their stories all pointed in one direction: corruption. When the verdict finally came down in August 2019, the courtroom was silent. Chad Scott was found guilty on 7 federal counts, 2 of perjury, 3 of obstruction of justice, and 2 of falsifying records. 2 years later, in 2021, he was convicted again, this time for conspiracy and theft of government property. And then came the sentence: 160 months. Over 13 years behind bars. That was the moment it all came full circle.
All that time, he was just, if they just found that, imagine how much other people he screwed.
Jack Schumacher, his old partner, had been quietly reassigned years earlier after his string of fatal shootings drew internal scrutiny. But Scott's conviction was different. It wasn't reassignment or retirement. It was punishment. The man who once claimed to be untouchable was now an inmate. When the news broke, Jay Prince didn't throw a party. There was no press conference or headline victory lap. He just left a quiet post on Instagram. They finally caught one of the 2 DEA agents assigned to take my life over a decade ago. A decade later, the truth has come to light. His words were calm, almost restrained, but the weight behind them was heavy.
After Scott was arrested last year, Jay Prince shared his thoughts on the matter in an Instagram post. So like I said, it's still real heavy on him to this day.
For him, it wasn't revenge. It was confirmation. Everything he and Scarface had said in their music, every name, every line, every accusation that had been brushed off as paranoia, had now been proven true by the same system that once called them criminals. Scarface didn't say much publicly, but the vindication was there between the lines. 20 years earlier, he'd recorded "Look Into My Eyes" and "The Gangsta," tracks that named Schumacher and Scott when no one else dared to. The government had treated those records as threats, but now they sounded prophetic. It had taken 2 decades, multiple trials, and a mountain of ruined lives, but in the end, the truth stood taller than the badge.